I'm very happy to have you again, Thomas, and we're going to continue discussing medieval warfare and different ways and techniques to defend fortifications or to take over fortifications. How the military in a besieged fort, in a castle, managed to survive a month-long siege, or maybe year-long siege, because some of these sieges were longer than a year. What supply they kept, and did they have a secret passage to bring in more food and water?
Well, that's a really good question, and thank you for inviting me again. That's always a pleasure to do the podcast with you. So on the first bit that I'd like to address is only a very handful of sieges lasted more than a few months. Nearly 80% of all sieges lasted less than 45 days. And so I looked at the number of food shortages, and the impression I had from reading the historical documents initially was that it was quite frequent, but it's not. It's only 39 sieges of 730 that I've studied that experienced one. So that shows two things. First, that shows about 5% of all sieges. And the second thing is that it shows medieval commanders were able to supply their places well, to prepare them well for sieges. And then I looked a bit more deeply in these 39 sieges that had issues. The first thing I saw was that half of them were in rather short sieges, lasting up to 45 days. And the rest of them, so the other half, was happening in sieges that were pretty long. So the first kind of conclusion I had with that sort of figures was to say that, well, sieges in general were not causing too much trouble because it's only a minority of these lasting for less than 45 days, then we can say, well, they didn't prepare enough because they were not able to just hold through the normal duration of siege. The longer one, obviously, you cannot expect the reserves to have been put for so long. Therefore, they still managed to do it and avoid many sieges that were long without having supply issues. And so I looked at the different methods that they used. And from what I've seen, it seems that they were doing their preparation in 3 times before siege. So the first time in the chronology is when they captured a site from the enemy, or they built one, a new castle. They tended to put a lot of supplies in at that moment to fill it, a very early commitment to supply their newly acquired sites. The reason for that is if the campaign was ending in a big failure, they still wanted the castles that they've taken or the cities they've taken to resist against an invasion when their army had to rest and to reform. So that, especially during the reign of Nur ad-Din, you have probably the most examples I got where during Nur ad-Din sort of reign. Obviously, it happened from the First Crusade till the death of Saladin very frequently, but I find it especially frequently mentioned in narratives from the reign of Nur ad-Din. Another timeline was just to renew the supplies quite frequently. and regularly. And here there were two methods that have been used. The first one was for most places to use the local production and local agriculture. So taking what has been produced and stock parts of it in the castle, not selling everything. The second method is a bit more rare and depends as important the site is. So for instance, the Fatimid, for them, Ascalon was the main place to defend. So they were sending 4 convoys every year to resupply the site. And obviously that was costing a lot of money, so they couldn't do it for every places, but Power tended to pick 1 or 2 sites that they judged extremely valuable, and they supplied them with more resources than the usual. And it worked pretty well. If we take the case of Ascalon, the Latin to take the site had to build from 1106 to 1153. They built multiple castles around Ascalon to isolate the place. And despite that, the siege of Ascalon in 1153 is a very long siege that lasted for a month. And that didn't surrender for food shortages. It was taken for military reason, not for logistical reasons. So that shows how effective it could have been. And the last moment was the sort of emergency gathering when a site learned that an enemy was arriving towards them to besiege them. And they were gathering what they could from surrounding places, so especially taking resources in villages, because this way they would have the enemy couldn't acquire it during the siege. Main reason why there were very few food shortage for the besieged, it's because the besiegers had the same issues. They had to supply their own forces as well, and they struggled in doing so. And it was much easier for the besieged sides to deprive than the besiegers experienced more problems than the besieged in the end. So I think that summarizes more or less who they did before the siege. And if we look at who they did it during the siege as well, because it's also an interesting feature, they tended to send foraging parties outside the site to just take the foods that might have been forgotten, or so it wasn't bringing a lot of food inside, obviously, but it was depriving the enemy from crucial supplies. The other method, but was quite rare and mostly limited to the sites that were on the coastline, was to send fleet from another settlement in the ports and just have a huge supply. And if we take the siege of Ascalon in 1153 again, there was one that was done during the siege, and it's 70 galleys that have been sent, which is an extremely important fleet for new foods. I think that summarizes a bit the methods that were used. You asked as well, I think, about the kind of supplies that were put in a site, isn't it?
Yeah. I can also say that the large cellar at the base of the castle kept containing everything necessary to supply a fortified village under the siege, or fortified town. And normally, like in case of Karak, you have secret passages. I'm not sure whether you've seen the Karak castle, but around the modern town of Karak, you have lots of underground tunnels that lead directly to the fortress, and they use these tunnels to bring water and food during a long siege. I've been in one of these tunnels in 2018, and it's like 500 meters under the castle.
So I've been in. Yeah. So I've not been able to visit these tunnels, but I went years ago, and I was not a researcher at that time. I still hope that I'll be able to to make a field trip to complete that. So yeah, on the secret tunnels and things like that, you don't have a lot of data, sadly, in the sources of the 12th century, especially in the written sources. So as my study is really focusing on these written sources more than archaeological remains or other kind of conclusions. I've not studied them. I know that someone like Michael Fulton, for instance, had been working on that quite a lot, on the archaeological side a bit more, showing the strength of fortifications, especially the use of pattern in walls, so hidden doors, hidden gates in the walls that were allowing a few men to get out, and that was used during sallies, for instance. That was also used by foraging parties to escape and come unnoticed by the besiegers when they were being out or in. Obviously, it was also a risk because if it was discovered, then it was becoming a weak point
of the defense, of course.
The side as well. Yeah. So they had to be very cautious. You didn't just do it all the time, or it would come very clear that a pattern was there. If we take the kind of foods or the kind of supplies that were put in a city, the main one is all kind of cereals, because they can last very, very long. If you actually take care of cereals pretty well, normally something like wheat, you can keep it about a century.
Yeah.
Because you just have the gas. That is something that is problematic. But if you basically move the grain every day to make the gas come off, then you can keep it. And you had basically a medieval work, which was just a guy that was doing that. That was his job. So that was the main sort of foods that you could find. And then you had a bit more fresh supplies, but they were limited in terms of duration and availability. So for instance, fresh meat or dairy were not used that much because they would not last a very long time. They were more used, especially for meat, in dried or salted version that could last for a few months instead, especially dried meat. But still, if the siege is lasting 2 years, which is exceptional, that would be problematic, and they would need to acquire new forms of meat during the siege. Quite interestingly as well, there is an episode during, I can't remember if it's the siege of Kerak or the siege of Shobak, during Saladin's reign after Hattin. The siege is lasting for about 2 years, and at one point the defenders of one of the two sides are lacking salt so much that they began to have issues with their vision.
With eyesight, yes. It's a case of Montreal. It's a case of Montreal or Shobak, not Karak.
Yeah.
It happened in Montreal.
Yeah.
They lost eyesight because of the lack of salt.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've actually came to inquire with doctors to see if that was a realistic conclusion from the source or not. And considering the time that the siege was lasting for, so nearly 2 years at that point, and they would need to have been deprived of salt for at least a few months completely. So no meat in whatever forms, but that is possible. It's unlikely that it was large scale, probably not as much as the narrative suggests, but it is something that is possible. That's an interesting conclusion of the lack of salt can do to soldiers, and obviously if you can't see, you can't fight. So yeah. So cereals, dried meat, and something they had was also use of vegetables and fruits, especially not in castles, but more in towns and cities, because in cities you often had, especially in cities that were built during the antiquity, often cities had reduced in size, but the walls were still there from ancient times. And so you had sections of gardens inside the town. For instance, in Antioch, that's the most famous case. They had gardens in sight when it was besieged during the First Crusade. And so they could have fresh vegetables and fruits coming also, which was having a huge impact, obviously, on how well the population and the troops inside could fight. The siege didn't last as long in Damascus during the Second Crusade in 1148, but the importance of the Ghouta as well is something that is quite important. The most of the fight was not against the city, but for the control of these gardens that were crucial to the logistics of both armies. And as soon as the Franks were pushed back from the gardens, basically when they decided to besiege another section of the wall, instead, they lacked food and they stopped the siege in literally days. So that shows the importance of that kind of fresh food as well. Another thing as well is the question of water, because especially in the Near East, in that kind of arid or semi-arid climate, water is crucial. And so modern estimates is that a man in June or July would need about 6 liters of water to drink per man per day. And for horses, it would be 50 liters. So to give you an idea, if we take the siege of Jerusalem during the First Crusade, that happened between 7th of June to 15th of July, 1099, the crusading army that was about 40,000 people would have needed about 200,000 liters per day in that regard, just for the men, not for horses. So that gives you an idea of how important water would be. And if you didn't have water, the effects are very fast to come as well. So I've been looking at the effects of dehydration on the body. So if you lose about 5% of your total body water, you become dizzy, you have cramps, you have pain, so you're not able to fight properly anymore. You can still fight, but not properly anymore.
No, it
if you lose
affects
10%, yeah,
it affects
yeah,
capability of fighting properly.
yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. 10% you can't fight anymore because you're going to bleed from the nose, you're going to have hallucinations, and the blood is going to leave your hand and feet to just focus on your living organs to make sure you live, and tend to go away from obviously non-necessary parts, or what the body considers to be non-necessary parts. And then if you go further and lose 15%, so that would happen in about 2 days, then you're just going to risk being in coma or dying within hours. So that shows the importance of having water and having enough of it. And if we take the case of the siege of Jerusalem, obviously it's very famous that the Crusaders struggled to get their water, and they because the besieged just took the measures to actually destroy water sources or hide water sources from the Crusaders in a radius of 6 miles around Jerusalem. And they knew where the sources were, so they put ambush parties a bit everywhere on the roads to make sure that if Crusaders were looking for water, they would be attacked. And in the meantime, the governor of Jerusalem decided to stock tens of millions of litre in the city using mainly cisterns, but also using pools and the aqueduct of the city to provide enough water. So you have the issue of water is probably the worst one, because lacking food, you can hold literally weeks without having much food, just rationing and having just the minimal amount. Water is a question of days. And every time there is a water shortage in a site, it's a rundown days. It's nearly automatic. If there is a shortage of food, in most cases, it's solved by the besieged at one point, and it's not the main reason to surrender or to just stop the siege. It's really water that is important. But yeah.
Okay. Regarding food, I think they prefer to store dried food and dried fruits and vegetables, because they can also stay for much longer than preserved meat, for instance, or dairy products that are going to go bad after a few days. You cannot preserve them for a long time.
Yeah, they did. They actually did, and you have, especially in documents written by Muslim authors, a lot of mention to as well peas that were dried as well, and then can last a lot of time and give vital nutrients as well that wouldn't be in cereals to the defenders. Obviously, dried fruits were also important in that. But you have, then that's the bit when you work about the 12th century, you have way less mentions about these as well than if you work about the 13th century and the 14th century, in which narratives and written documents or even archives give you much more information about that than they would in the 12th century. So the best you can do in my period is to look at the few references that exist and compare them with later periods for which you have more sources, especially on the nature of peas, for instance. Peas are quite frequently mentioned in the 12th century, but you don't know in which form. And deducting from 13th century practice, because the practice certainly didn't change between a siege in the 1180s and a siege in the 1220s. That probably didn't change much, but in the 1220s, you know that it was dried peas. So it's very likely that in the 1180s it was as well. But obviously, there is the lack of direct evidence, which is problematic. It's one of the main issues with working with the 12th century for the Crusades. But it's also something that's quite interesting, because you need to fill the gaps of knowledge, which is always quite interesting to do.
What equipment were used during besiege of fortifications and towns? We're talking about attackers now. What type of yeah, please.
If we look at siege engines,
yes.
So the main kind of preconceived idea is that battering rams were used very frequently. And this wasn't the case for one main reason. Entrance gates were not having just one gate, but it was actually bent entrance. So your battering ram would actually destroy the first door and couldn't turn to attack the second one. So that would be useless to use battering rams. The only mentions of battering rams are against walls, not against gates.
Okay,
And
yes.
it's mainly in the 13th century, not really in the 12th century as well. But Michael Fulton did a pretty good job in showing that as much as battering ram in Western Europe, especially against wooden fortresses, were probably used quite a lot. It's not the case in the East. In the Middle East, battering rams are nearly never used, and they're not efficient. The main siege engines that are used are either artillery that obviously will not destroy walls in general. They will destroy the merlons, so the earth part of the walls. By destroying these and then sending archers, you are able to make the enemy abandon a section of the wall before attacking it. So that would be the main use. The second use would be more psychological, by destroying houses inside the city with the artillery. But mostly it wasn't used to attack the walls because it wasn't powerful enough, or because it would take so long to actually put a wall down that you better have to use undermining instead. And sapping was really frequent. That's not obviously a siege engine, but that's the preferred method, to go under instead of destroying the wall to breach them. And then the other solution is to go over the walls, and for that you need to use ladders or siege towers. Interestingly, siege towers are really a Frankish practice. They're not an Islamic practice at all in the period I'm studying. It's mainly the Franks, and mainly in the first few decades of the Crusades. It nearly disappeared after the 1130s, and that's quite an interesting one. And then ladders are the main solution, and they're used by Islamic troops. They're used by Franks as well. And I think the main reason is the availability of wood. Having a ladder, you can transport it, you can build it before, you can reuse it. Whereas a siege tower, you have to build it on the site you're attacking. And apart from a few sites in which you have enough wood, especially on the coastline or in Lebanon, you're not going to have enough forest to build siege towers. And well, obviously the famous case of Jerusalem during the First Crusade, in which sheep are basically used to build the siege tower because there was not enough wood in Jerusalem. And you need a certain type of wood as well, because it needs to be tall and strong enough to be used. You cannot use olive trees to make a siege tower. So that's for the main siege equipment that was used. But the most efficient way was usually to use mining more than artillery or ladders. And most of the sites were falling by a surrender, not by an assault as well.
Okay, I'm going to. If you want to add something, please go ahead. We still have 5.5 minutes.
I think on siege engines itself, not that much. On logistics, I'd say maybe something is I focused on the system in which people were acquiring food during sieges, and it's a kind of weird system that I wasn't expecting to find initially, because nowadays you would expect that the state would deliver the food to people during a siege. And my question was there any public attempt as well from the rulers? And it seems that it wasn't the case, which is not too surprising in itself. But it seems that you had two systems at the same time that were coexisting, a sort of system by the ruling elites, and a system that was a sort of private system. So you had basically the public stock. What I will call as public stock is the stocks that the ruling elites have. It's not public as we mean today.
Yeah, of course.
So they were providing every day with food, a certain amount of food, to bakeries or to markets or food shops in a city.
Yeah.
and these were able to bake it and then to sell it to inhabitants. And it's quite an interesting system because you have that sort of public regulation of the food distribution and the food reserves. But in the end, people have to pay for it, even when there is a lack of food. And even foraging parties that are sent to get food on the surroundings, then when they come back, either to the besiegers' camp or the besieged camp, they sell what they've found. They're not giving it for free, despite they can be stipended troops, so paid by the local governors. So that was an interesting system that I found. And the only kind of free food that could be acquired either by troops, when instead of being paid in money, they're paid in food.
They were paid in food, yes.
Or when the elites, especially the religious elites, decide to make charity to the poorest inhabitants in the city. And that's the two only examples I get of public management of food and sort of giving of food instead of paying. But yeah, I think that was a system that was interesting to just talk about.
I'm going to send you another link in a while. Yeah.
All right.
Give me a few minutes.
Yeah.
See you soon.
Yeah. That's all good. So yeah, do you have any other questions?
I'm going to have more questions in the second session because now we're running out of time.
All right.
It's 2 minutes and 20 seconds.
Yeah. Fair enough. I'll wait for the link and I'll just
just wait for the link.
Join. All right.
I'm going to give you the link in 8-9 minutes. Now we're going to talk about thermal weapons, meaning different devices that use heat or burning action in order to destroy or damage soldiers or enemy personnel or fortifications. What type of thermal weaponry they use in the medieval period, or to be more precise, more specific, during Crusades?
So the main one is naphtha.
Yeah.
So obviously you have so many different recipe of what naphtha could have been that it's difficult to define it in an easy way, but it's quite close to the Greek fire.
Yeah.
Obviously, in a way, it tends to use some form of petrol in the recipe in general, but then the ingredients change quite a lot depending on whose author you're reading about. So from what I've seen in the 12th century, there tend to be two kind of uses that were made of it. So one was to use it with siege artillery, but it was quite rare in that regard because that would require a higher quantity of it as well, and it was something that was quite precious, and to use not to use too many at the same time. It can also go very wrong if you miss, or that. The other use that was more frequent is to use sort of grenades of naphtha, and that seems to have been the main use. And from what I've seen in sources, it tends to be used by Muslim much more than by the Franks at the time, even if the Crusaders had some use recorded, but very rare, more in later periods like the 13th century. But in the 12th century, it's really an Islamic practice, or mainly an Islamic practice. And the thing that is quite interesting with it is the target. It's rarely used directly against fortifications. It's not used against gates themselves. It tends to be used against siege engines.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really interesting that Well, either it was thrown on Frankish siege towers to burn them to avoid the sites to be taken. It seems to have been working pretty well in general, but if the wind was going wrong, then it could burn the wall as well, or at
Yeah.
least some bits of the wall. So it was a risky use. The other use that I've seen was against siege artillery, and in that case, it wasn't thrown from the walls. It was used during a sally. So a few men, especially at night, would sally out. It tends to be especially young men that try to prove the value or to make a name for themselves in the army. That go out, try to throw hand grenades on the trebuchet or a mangonel or any form of siege artillery to burn it, and it can be very efficient because these engines are very expensive to build. They require specific engineers. So destroying one
A
is a
big
bit
damage.
setback.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
inflict a
it would
big
be a
damage
huge
by doing
setback.
this.
And as well, um, sometimes people have the impression that tens, if not hundreds, of siege artillery were used. That's what you can see in movies or in video games. But um, usually it was one, two, sometimes three, and going up to a dozen in the biggest examples of that use. So destroying one can be decisive. Destroying two or three would completely put the besiegers off siege engines in most cases. So they have to build others. We have that example in the Siege of Arc during the Search Crusades, in which we have specifically the price of the damage that was given, and it's representing. So I can't remember the exact price, but it's representing something like at least 6 months of wage for mercenary knight. Um, it's at least something like 60 at least, which is huge for it was a decisive use overall when it was used, even if it could go very wrong. So it was either decisive in favor of using it or decisive against them if the wind was going wrong. But it was nearly never a weapon that had no effect. And that's probably why people tend to focus quite a lot on it as well, because it's such psychologically important as well for the enemy to have fire. Fire is something frightening. The fire that you cannot stop as well is especially worrying. And they'll put like try to put skin and vinegar, animal skin and vinegar on their siege engines to protect them. Sometimes it's told to be efficient, sometimes it's told not to be efficient. So I'm not sure exactly what conclusion to have on the efficiency of vinegar to stop that, but it's probably what I'd go in that is it's probably not that efficient, but it might have been efficient when the siege engine was not hit directly.
I never tried this
Um,
at my home, so I don't know whether
yeah.
vinegar will save me from burning down the whole place, but maybe I should try that at my
Maybe
friend's apartment
experimental
or
archaeology. To be fair, some people have tried to reproduce the recipe of nafta
yeah,
in experimental archaeology.
of course.
The problem is it's never really working well. So
Okay.
maybe one day they will succeed in doing one that is working efficiently, and they will be able to try the effects of vinegar
Good.
properly. But so far, I'm not sure we can really say apart from making conjectures. But I will not try at home.
No, no, these things shouldn't be tried at home. But how how effectively thermal weaponry was used during
Um,
crusades? Yeah, you said that Muslim armies used naphtha more than Frankish armies. or
Yeah.
Frankish towns that were usually besieged by Saracens.
So the efficiency is difficult to assess in a long
Yeah.
thing because it tends to be if depend on what kind of efficiency you're speaking of. If you're speaking of efficiency to burn down a siege engine, then it's super effective. It's probably the most effective weapon available. It's going to be a big economical setback for the besiegers. It might be enough to make them lift the siege as well, but in most situations, it will delay the damage caused by a new artillery. So it will make them build another one, which is obviously on the long term of the siege, it has helped you to resist longer, so you have a higher chance to win the siege. But it's not going to win the siege by itself. So it's a limited scale, but very efficient on a limited scale.
I mean, we have suggestions, hints how to put down the fire by using milk, urine, and sand and earth. This is what some of commanders or people in charge of security of fortifications advise their inhabitants to do in case of warfare and in case of the siege. So these materials they recommended for grenades and incendiary devices, and I don't think that it's very efficient to use urine or milk against naphtha.
Yeah, it would probably not work.
It can backfire.
Yeah. On I know that, for instance, in Nikita Lisev in the 50s,
Yeah.
when he was studying Nur ad-Din, had looked at the builds and the materials used to build houses in different cities like Damascus and Aleppo, and that Damascus had an especially efficient way of building to counter fire by using basically in the houses, the walls were made of layers of poplar and clay, successive layers, and that was apparently efficient to delay the
Of
fire
course,
and give more
to
time
make it
to stop
to
it.
make it slower.
And but how much was that build frequent? How much was it actually efficient when in a city? Because obviously the big problem in cities is that fire spread very easily.
Because they were congested.
Yeah, exactly. The access of water is also quite limited. So it's difficult to know how efficient that was. Narratives are not really giving any information on how efficient it is. Probably efficient to prevent sort of domestic fire more than war effects at a larger scale in general. But yeah, it's a suggestion that could have worked. Obviously, you have houses in which walls are built in stone. In that case, that would be slightly more efficient as well to counter fire at the condition that wood is not um, used.
Wasn't a building
Or
material here till
yeah,
now. Till now, it's not
and
the building material.
yeah, it's mainly like clay, poplar, and different type of stones, especially limestone, that tends to be found in the period. So probably quite efficient in that regard. But if you go a bit north, um, especially a city like Antioch, well, you have that example during the First Crusade in which Bohemond is supposed to have uh, provoked a voluntary fire in the city to make people go out their house. Is it true? Is it not true? We can debate it, but it's probably if you go in northern Syria or in southern Turkey, in which you had more mountains, more forest as well, you might find a bit more wood in houses. and that might have favored fire a bit more. But it's difficult to know how efficient countermeasures would have been. It's not only thermal weapons that were used, to be fair, you also had like smoke, like colored smoke or poison smoke. There was a very interesting article by Abbès Zouache that had been written a few years ago, article in French for the Annales Islamologiques, in which he was speaking about the different colors that were used, the different poison that could be used. The conclusion was that as much as it is psychologically very interesting, it had probably very little effect, like practical effect, apart from psychological.
But we had some of the first versions of biological warfare when Tatars besieged Kaffa in Crimea, and they threw corpses of Tatars who died of plague in order to infect the military inside the fortress. And this is one of the versions how Black Plague spread around the Middle East and Europe.
Obviously, difficult to test any of that, and it's clearly out of my region, so I'm clearly no expert on that.
But I discussed that with Stefan Paul, with Dr. Stefan Paul. We discussed that matter regarding the spread of the bubonic plague in in 14th century.
One in sieges, like you have a few examples as well in the 12th century in the Crusades, in which disease are becoming problematic, especially when a battle happened near a river and too many corpses or blood has been
polluted,
in the river itself, and how much it can poison the water for the besieged. But overall, as much as disease were a problem, it seems that the main reason for disease were not that much that a source of water was polluted and something like that, even if you have examples like bread that was spoiled by the besiegers and sent in the city to make people sick. Most of the examples of disease are because of the few examples of food shortages that happened. So the body immune system was becoming weaker for people, and they were more likely to get sickness, and then disease spread. Because the main sort of thinking of people is they're going to die from starvation. People don't die from starvation in general. They die from the sickness they get from starvation. And that's an interesting one as well, to see like that disease overall. We have nearly no knowledge on how it was handled by powers, how doctors were sort of healing people during sieges. The only few examples we have are coming from Usama ibn Munkid chronicle, in which he's speaking about sort of specialized people in repairing bones in the siege of Shaizah in 1138 by the Greeks and the Franks. But apart from that, examples,
there's some literally... they were all the orthopedists. These guys who were fixing bones.
We know a lot of things about how hospitals were used in the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, but that's not during sieges, that outside sieges. So how much was it impacted in times of siege is a question. And as well, most of the knowledge, and that's something I repeat quite a lot, but most of the knowledge we have, the detailed knowledge, is coming from the 13th century more than the 12th, because we have more archives available. We have documents that are not chronicles as well, that focus on people, more letters that explain more daily life matters, when the 12th century narratives are really chronicles, historia, annals, which are not day-to-day life. The only real source we can use for day-to-day life is Usama and his kitab. But apart from that, it's mainly sometime an anecdote that
Of
is in the
course.
chronicle to explain something else, but it's very limited. I must say, like when my PhD will be done, um, I'm going to probably continue to work on siege warfare, but I'm likely going either to try to focus a bit more on the East, maybe going studying a bit more Iraq and Iran, especially probably the city of Baghdad that have quite a lot of interesting narrations of different sieges that I'd like to explore a bit more, or probably trying to go in the 13th century a bit more as well. But we'll see. It will depend on the sources I can find interesting or not. But the PhD obviously it is not finished. I'm writing it, but it will still take
It will take you
quite a
some
bit of
time.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So but it's an interesting one, to be fair, to look at daily life. And sometimes you find a daily life information completely lost in the middle of other things. And you wondered why it's here, but it's so valuable when you find one. It's probably the hardest to find.
Do you want to add anything else?
No, I think on logistics and we've pretty much talked about the topic. Obviously, we could focus on specific examples, but that's not really the format I
Yeah.
think that would fit a podcast here. But yeah, no, I think it's pretty good.
I'll wish you good luck with your studies and with your pursuit for the PhD. We're going
Well, thank
to stay in touch, and I'm planning to run more articles about your research. So
well,
far, we
I'm happy.
published only two, and maybe I'm planning to prepare the third one in a couple of weeks. So I'll let you know.
Yeah, I'm happy for that. Obviously, a theme that we've not talked so far of, but that could be the topic of another
Yeah,
podcast. Could be speaking about Sally's in a
yeah,
bit more depth.
we can talk about it.
I'm currently writing the chapter about Sally's for my PhD, which is showing quite a lot of difference with what I have during my MA dissertation. So that's quite interesting. But yeah, once it's done, I'm happy to speak about
No,
that in a
we're
bit
going
more
to talk
depth.
before you finish because you've been preparing your PhD for a while, maybe 2, 3 years, if I'm not mistaken.
It's actually the end of my fourth year. I'm going to
Yeah,
submit it in
so I'm
September.
not going to wait you for another 4 years. We can talk. We can talk
Exactly.
before the end of this spring. Actually,
Oh
it's
yeah,
still
no, because
officially
the
we're still
tutorial
in the
is
winter time, but we'll talk in a couple of weeks. I'm planning to
no,
talk with you.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine with me. As I was saying, the chapter on Sally's will be done by probably by the beginning of April. So,
Maybe we
and
can
I know
talk.
what I have in. It's
Yeah.
more the writing. I know what I'm going to put in, so I'm able to talk about it.
We can talk about it. Yes.
Yeah,
Thank you so
so
much.
happy to do another one.
No, no, we'll definitely keep in touch, and I'm planning to discuss.
Sorry, I didn't hear that last
No,
bit.
no, I said that I'm planning to talk about medieval warfare in a couple of weeks, maybe in April. Mid-April will be good, and we'll
Yeah,
coordinate.
yeah,
Good
that's
luck.
absolutely good with me.
Yeah,
Well,
sorry.
thank you for the invitation again.
And also, if you have some interesting colleagues, you can send them to me. Seriously, because I'm looking
Absolutely.
for new researchers and new scholars. As I told you, this period was very busy, and it's going to remain very hectic for probably another 6, 7 months, if not more. So
Let's spread the word.
I need fresh blood. We'll keep in touch.
We'll keep in touch. Have a nice day then, and
Thank you so
see
much.
you.
See you in a
Thank
while.
you as well for the invitation.
All the best.
All the best.
Bye bye.
Bye.